Hello and welcome back. This is Transmedia Storytelling from Mythology to Marvel, Lecture 9, Additive Comprehension. Now, because this is... because that last lecture lasted so long, I'm going to try and blow through this one. So with a little luck, this one will be short as opposed to the last one's epic misadventure. But that said, this is probably the most important lecture of the whole class. Because this is a crucial idea that I've been kind of hinting at through the previous lectures that I really want you to try and incorporate into your plans. So, additive comprehension is the reward. Additive comprehension is the payoff, right? It's that reward for overcoming the inherent resistance and jumping between media, the in-joke, the aha moment, the feeling like an insider because the additional knowledge the transmedia audience has had over a traditional one. This is the payoff, right? This is where the game design aspect, comes into developing a transmedia story experience. The world, all the world building stuff we've been doing, that's basically laying the groundwork. This stuff, how you stitch these pieces together, is how you make people fall in love with your project. So remember, people are lazy, right? We talked about this in the transmedia resistance thing. People are lazy beasts. They do not want to do work. There is an inherent transmedia resistance anytime you ask anybody to jump from one medium to the other because it's work. Just the act of transitioning from one kind of media consumption into another is itself kind of laced with resistance. If you've ever been reading a web page and then there's a video in the middle of it, and that little kind of groan you get inside, you're like, oh, I was just reading, I don't want to watch a video, or vice versa. You know exactly what I'm talking about. So this is why using these kinds of methods in order to reward people for doing that is going to be the secret of making any of this work. So one of the easiest ways to do this is to pose a small mystery in the main story, provide the answer in a side story, right, in a tie-in novel or a comic book or something like that, but then the answer that you pose in that side story needs to have a significant transformative impact on how your audience understands the main story, and here's the trick, without having it be necessary to understand the main story. Remember what we were talking about in the last lecture, how J.J. Abrams' Star Wars stories in the sequel trilogy were sometimes completely over-reliant on using those extra stories. So the fact that the Emperor came back from the dead at the beginning of Episode 9, Rise of Skywalker, with no real explanation, that sent users, well, for starters, that bounced the audience out of the story. It was enough of a disruption that it made all of us say, wait. That's not supposed to happen. There's no explanation here for why he's back from the dead. How did that happen? That was impossible. How did that happen? And Abrams just waved it away. And there is, as of this recording, to the best of my knowledge, still no great straightforward answer that is easy to find in any of the ancillary Star Wars media. It still remains sort of a mystery. I know there was talk of a novel that was meant to explain it, but the fact that I'm a pretty decent Star Wars nerd, and I don't know where the answers to those are. That's reflective of a kind of really strong resistance, which is itself reflective of the fact that, to be honest, I was pissed that there wasn't enough of a hint in the story to explain that violation of the internal rules of the universe. That my suspension of disbelief, which is core to engaging your audience in this sort of flow state, to keep people listening and enthralled in the story that you're telling them, that violation of trust was so profound in that particular story that I was resistant to even put in the time to go, look into those answers, because it felt like bad storytelling. Anyway, when we talk about additive comprehension, it's a term that was coined by the game designer Neil Young, not the musician Neil Young, different Neil Young, to refer to the ways that each new text adds a new piece of information which forces us to revise our understanding of the fiction as a whole. So in Convergence Culture, the book that Henry Jenkins wrote that popularized this term, there's a chapter about the origami unicorn, right? And that's a reference to what the example that Neil Young here uses, which is in Blade Runner, which is the classic sci-fi movie in which Harrison Ford plays a bounty hunter that is in charge of going and tracking down replicants, rogue replicants, which are basically androids that look like people. The part of the story is that Deckard, Harrison Ford's character, has been having these recurring dreams about unicorns, these little origami unicorns, and in the main movie, it's like, oh, that's kind of cool. In the director's cut of the movie, however, Deckard finds an origami unicorn that's been left for him by one of the replicants that he's hunting, which then suggests that the replicants know what he's thinking, which then suggests that Deckard himself might be a replicant, or the very thing that he's hunting down, because the replicants have this kind of shared neural network between them, right? So that one scene changes the way that you understand that character of Deckard. It changes the way that you understand that story. It changes their character motivations. And so if that were a DVD extra on the Blu-ray disc, right, watching that one extra scene, or that tie-in comic book, or that tie-in novel in which that scene was incorporated, would change your understanding of the rest of the story, right? So, as Henry writes, transmedia producers have found it difficult to achieve the delicate balance between creating stories which make sense to first-time viewers and building in elements which enhance the experience of people reading across multiple media. So, let's go back to that franchise map with the side story stuff that I brought up for X-Files in the last lecture. If you look at this applied to the Star Wars universe, there's a whole bunch of stuff inside of these stories that transform how we understand the main storyline. Right? So if you are enough of a Star Wars fan to go and watch the episodes of the Clone Wars, then so much of the relationship between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker in episode between episodes 2 and 3 becomes radically more tragic. At the beginning of episode 3, we see them as these brothers in arms, but only by watching multiple episodes of that show do we really understand, what's at stake between these two guys. Similarly, the story of Darth Maul, right? The weird tattooed faced dude, red guy with a double-bladed lightsaber, the bad guy that's introduced in episode 1. That story comes back, and that story comes back in some interesting ways that reveals that Maul's not dead inside of the Clone Wars. And then that is further explored in the second animated series, Star Wars Rebels. Right? And by knowing that, by understanding, by watching those other episodes, then that one beat at the very end of Solo, the tie-in, young Han Solo movie, where the hologram appears with a living Darth Maul in it, suddenly makes more sense. Right? So you understand that scene a lot better if you have seen these other cartoons that explain how that character might actually be alive at that point in time. Now, note that that is not a violation of trust to the same degree as the Return of the Emperor in Rise of Skywalker, right? Because it's not a huge plot point. It's that sort of Nick Fury at the end of Iron Man, kind of moment that hints that there's more story to be told, right? But it's not the kind of thing that's going to destroy your understanding and disrupt your suspension of disbelief for the core story itself, right? So if you look at this model, what you can understand is that the main Star Wars movies are the simple stories or the main quests inside this franchise, and then the tie-ins, the cartoons, and the extra shows like The Mandalorian, these are all the side stories and side quests, right? Same thing goes if you look at the original Matrix model we discussed at the very beginning of this class, right? So the main storyline between the Matrix movies can be understood on their own, more or less, but it makes way more sense if you spend the extra time and effort, watching the Animatrix animation, specifically the Second Renaissance and Final Flight of the Osiris that are found on those extra discs, and then play the Enter the Matrix video game that's slotted in between the second and third Matrix movies. There is a beat in the Matrix where this guy shows up at the beginning of the movie, right? and he comes running up to Neo, Keanu Reeves' character, and goes, Neo, 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 and he's basically humping Keanu Reeves' leg. And those of us that had never seen this dude before be like, who's this jackass, right? Well, if you watch the Animatrix, there's a story in there that introduces this particular character, who is creatively named The Kid, and explains how and why the kid believes that Neo saved his life, right? And that's where that sort of disciple worship, comes from for that individual character. So you have a better understanding of that character, and you have a better understanding of that story if you had spent that extra time and effort to watch that animated transmedia extension, right? It's not necessary. You could still basically gloss over it and be like, oh, this kid's just weird. But you understand that character way better if you've had the entire transmedia experience. Now, Andrea Phillips, in her book Creator's Guide to Transmedia Storytelling, points out that this isn't just constrained to sci-fi stories, right? So Andrea's example is, imagine that you had a romance drama, and at some point this woman who has gone through a lot breaks a teacup, and that teacup, the breaking of that teacup just sends her into tears, right? If that's the only information you have about that scene, then you'd read it and say, oh, well, okay, she's just been through a lot, and that's just the last straw. But if the story was told in a transmedia way, and there was an additional short story that had been a flashback to reveal that this one teacup was the last thing that she had to remember her late grandmother by, then you'll understand that one scene with a much greater degree of emotional investment. My favorite example of this is in The Dark Knight, right? The second of Christopher Nolan's Batman movies. So The Dark Knight had a alternate reality game was launched as part of its marketing campaign called Why So Serious, right? And Why So Serious, an alternate reality game, I think we talked about this before, but now I can't remember. An alternate reality game is one in which players are invited to participate in real-world events to solve real-world puzzles. You might solve a puzzle that is presented to you on a website, and then the solution to that puzzle might be a set of coordinates that will lead you to the local park, perhaps and then when you get to the local park, there's some dude there handing out these "I believe in Harvey Dent" signs, and then you are invited to go, march in a campaign exercise for Harvey Dent, which is, of course, a big marketing stunt for the movie, right? But at that point, you are able to effectively pretend that you are in the world of Gotham. Same thing goes at greater degrees of immersion when you are invited to basically be one of the thugs in Joker's gang. So show up at this particular place, this particular time, in full clown makeup. That's where you get our friend here on the right. If you successfully participated in all these different events over the course of the campaign, the alternate reality game, those people that effectively won the game were treated to a unique Jokerized version of the Dark Knight trailer before the movie was released, right? So it was the first time this trailer had ever been seen, but it had been specially edited as if the Joker had gotten a hold of it and written "ha ha 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 ha" over, parts of it had scribbled over Batman's face, and so on and so forth. But my favorite example of this was not only were players able to, be campaigners for Harvey Dent or thugs for the Joker, but they were also able to participate as members of this vigilante group that were inspired by Batman. Right? And this ought to sound familiar. In the opening scenes of The Dark Knight, there's that beat where multiple wannabe Batmen are going up against the Scarecrow in that parking garage and getting their asses kicked until Batman himself shows up. And not only does Batman stop the Scarecrow and tie up Scarecrow and all of his goons, he also ties up the vigilantes. And the one vigilante looks up at him and says, "What makes you so different from us?" And Batman growls back, "I'm not wearing hockey pants," right? Well, later on, Captain Hockey Pants there was the same dude that the Joker captures and kills and slams up against the mayor's window in this outfit, right? And so at that moment in the theater, it was shocking, right? But it was radically more shocking if you had played the alternate reality game, because during those bits of the game where you were playing as one of the Batman vigilantes, this was the guy that you were interfacing with. This was the guy that was giving you your clues. This was the guy that gets giving you your missions. And so at that moment, at that beat in the theater, like, some people were like, ooh, that's really gnarly. But the people that played the game would have been like, oh my God, they killed Bob, right? And so those people in the theater that played the game had a much more visceral reaction, a much more intimate reaction, to that one particular scene, and it was transformative for them, right? That's that kind of a thing you really want to try and design into your stories, if humanly possible, as rewards for that extra time and investment. Same thing goes for Star Trek, right? So I talked about this before. When J.J. Abrams rebooted Star Trek in 2009, there was this sense of trepidation among long-term Trekkers, right? And that was going to be too much of a hard reboot, and that there was no, farewell to the Star Trek universe that we had, grown up with and loved for so long. So what they did was they partnered with IDW Comics, and they released this comic series leading up to Star Trek called Countdown, which the Star Trek movie deals with Spock, who is the Leonard Nimoy's character in the original Star Trek shows, in his old age, is unable to prevent the planet of Romulus from exploding in this big, huge accident. And there is this Romulan guy named Nero who is really super pissed off about that. And Spock and Nero are both thrown back in time. And that divergence from the original timeline is what sets up the J.J. Abrams movie. So they basically set it up as this like alternate timeline called the Kelvin timeline, so that all of us happy old Trekker fans could still enjoy our old stories and know that those characters still exist in their own original timeline moving forward, while new Trek fans can enjoy the adventures of Chris Pine and his crew on their own particular timeline. It was actually very elegantly done. But there are parts of that movie that make way more sense if you had read the Star Trek Countdown comics. And then after that, after the movie, IDW continued on with its own ongoing Star Trek series that kept that plotline going right up until Into Darkness, which was the Star Trek sequel, right? So when they came back for the sequel, they very imaginatively created another lead-in comic series called Countdown to Darkness, which explained a bunch of the backstory and made a bunch of the scenes in Into Darkness make more sense, and then picked up after that movie left off with After Darkness, again, very imaginatively named. So if you start to look at this, right, the two main Star Trek movies here are the tentpoles in the franchise. The comics are the extra side stories or the spin-off, kind of content. It's still set in the same timeline, it still features the same characters, but they're much more optional. But the overall experience you get is way better if you spend that extra time and money in order to have those experiences. Same thing goes if you had come to this with the previous knowledge of the Star Trek universe. So there are particular characters in the new franchise, like Harvey Mudd, for example, that if you see them in the new series without any context, you're like, oh, that's an interesting character. But if you see them having grown up with Star Trek or experienced all these other Star Trek franchise stories, you're like, I know who that character is. I see what they're doing. This is going to be fascinating to see how they handle it. Same thing goes for Benedict Cumberbatch's take on Khan in Into Darkness, right? That idea of seeing the familiar made unfamiliar is a key experience of this kind of storytelling. So, this kind of concept, this additive comprehension as a reward for all the extra time and money, is crucial to building a really successful and awesome transmedia experience. So thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.